Welcome to Proving the Point, where we discuss important research papers that you should know about. Today I'm going to discuss this paper called Racial Differences in Hypertension, Implications for High Blood Pressure Management. And as the title states, the rates of hypertension, which is high blood pressure, differ across racial and ethnic lines, both in America and across the world more broadly. And specifically, Africans and African Americans tend to have higher rates of hypertension than other groups. And we're going to talk about why that's the case, focusing on some genetic differences and some environmental factors that might be contributing to this. The reason that the paper matters is that hypertension is linked to most other health outcomes. So it's linked to things like obesity. It's linked to things like heart failure. It's linked to kidney disease, liver disease, brain disorders, all kinds of different health problems. And you might have heard that African Americans tend to have worse health outcomes by numerous different metrics compared to white Americans. And oftentimes people attribute this to, like, the growing narrative is that this is caused by like institutional or systemic discrimination against African Americans or privileges that white Americans experience. But there are important genetic differences that might be contributing to all of this instead. And so the reason we need to discuss this paper is because it helps combat that narrative that health disparities are due to, mistreatment of African Americans by white Americans, because I think that's a dangerous narrative. Okay, so we're going to go through this paper. It's actually a review article, so if you've watched my other videos, I mostly want to cover primary research articles where they do their own research, but this is a review article summarizing other people's research. But nonetheless, it's still important, and we're going to go through a couple primary articles in a minute. But just going through some of the basics, we'll talk about the specific numbers in a minute, but hypertension rates are, and have been for a long time, significantly higher in African Americans than Caucasian Americans. And all the downstream diseases caused by hypertension also tend to vary across racial lines in a similar way. So for example, stroke, that happens whenever, there's like a blood clot in your brain. Okay, you're predisposed to strokes when you have hypertension. Well, because African Americans have higher rates of hypertension, they also have higher rates of strokes. Likewise, kidney disease, renal disease. Okay, hypertension is the number one cause of kidney disease and kidney failure. Well, they say end-stage renal disease is 5 times more common in African American men and women. That's again in comparison to Caucasian Americans. Also, some of these diseases, their age of onset is earlier for African Americans. So in other words, not only are they more likely to get these diseases, they're getting them sooner in their life compared to white Americans. So they give some statistics here. This paper, by the way, it's a bit dated now. It's from 2014, so the numbers have changed. But they talk about like the rates of hypertension. It was around 45% for like African American men and closer to 23% for white men. And the rates are lower for women, but they follow the same trend, where for women it's lower. Hypertension rates are lower for white women and much higher for black women. And there's many, many studies that have shown this. Okay. And the rates of hypertension in society are increasing. So I believe the numbers are higher today, significantly. I think it's over 50% of black adults have hypertension in America. So very high number. Okay. I think before we get too far into it, we should just explore some of the effects of hypertension. So I mentioned that hypertension is linked to most other chronic diseases, just to show you that, so you'd think I'm not making it up. We could go to Google Scholar and type in, hypertension and, pick your health outcome. Hypertension is known to be related to it. So you could go to obesity. Hypertension promotes obesity because it causes metabolic dysfunction. Hypertension is known to cause heart failure because hypertension, that's high blood pressure. That means basically there's more pressure that your heart has to work against whenever it's pumping, which causes the heart to wear down more quickly, and then it causes heart disease. Okay. Atherosclerosis. So atherosclerosis, that's where you get like fat clogging your arteries and your blood vessels. Well, hypertension promotes that because hypertension, again, high blood pressure, that's high pressure in your blood vessels. Well, that's damaging to your blood vessels, and that damage basically makes fat more likely to stick to the walls of your blood vessels, in simple terms. Okay, you can look up lung disease. Okay, hypertension is a major cause of lung disease. So it's truly the case that most chronic disease is downstream of hypertension. Okay, so, and again, the reason for that, it's kind of intuitive. If you have too much pressure on your blood vessels, that's going to damage your blood vessels in every organ. And what that means is that you can't get nutrients properly transported to your organs. You can't get oxygen properly transported to your organs. So then your organs can't function properly, and that means you're more likely to get disease. Okay, and you can look at like cognitive impairment also. So hypertension is also linked to cognitive impairment and brain problems, or even probably neurodegenerative diseases. Okay, so you name it, hypertension promotes it when it comes to disease. Okay, so it's a very significant finding that Africans and African Americans have, in some cases, approaching double the rates of hypertension to white people. Okay. All right. So like I said, a lot of this is attributed, we'll talk about the causes of this later, but a lot of it has been attributed to social factors. There's certainly probably some social influence. There are different rates of stress by race also, and that impacts blood pressure. There are dietary differences, which we'll talk about in a minute, that can impact blood pressure. Okay, but there's reason to think that it's not solely based on like socioeconomic conditions or discrimination or stress or things like that. So one line of reasoning is that hypertension discrepancies between the races have actually been growing, not shrinking, even as presumably there's less discrimination as time goes on in America, with all like the interventions meant to ameliorate that. So that would suggest it's not primarily or even solely due to social factors and discrimination. Also, these discrepancies start to appear even in children. So even if we ignore adults for a minute and focus on children, you can see that even then, black children have higher blood pressure than white children. So that starts to imply that it's a innate biological phenomenon. Doesn't prove it, and we'll talk more later about other evidence for that. Okay, but this starts to suggest that maybe it's more biological than environmental. Okay, and so another line of reasoning that suggests it's not due to social factors or discrimination solely is that if you look at rates of treatment and awareness of hypertension across race, it's basically the same. So in other words, it's not the case that white people have access to better treatment for hypertension than black people do in America. If you look at the rates, it's basically the same. And even when you correct for that, there's still a hypertension difference. Likewise, it's not due to differences in awareness of the harms of hypertension by race. So black people and white people, as we'll see in a minute, are basically equally aware that hypertension is harmful. Okay, so just to show that real quickly, there's this other paper. And so if we scroll straight down to their results, we'll see this is showing in this column is the prevalence of hypertension across race, and you can see once again they show Black Americans have higher rates of hypertension compared to white Americans. Although they have different numbers, that's because they're studying a different population now. But then again, they look at awareness of the harms of hypertension. And it's the same, basically, statistically the same across races. Likewise, if you look at treatment availability and access, it's the same between white Americans and Black Americans. So that differences in medical treatment cannot explain the discrepancy in hypertension rates between the races. And interestingly, if you look in this last column, this control, so medical intervention can help most people control their blood pressure, or at least around half of the people with hypertension. But if you look here, you'll see white Americans respond better to most medical interventions than Black Americans do. In other words, around half of white Americans with hypertension, they can get it under control with medication, but it's significantly less than half of Black Americans with hypertension can get their blood pressure under control with medications. So this suggests that they're not exactly responding to medications the same way, and that again suggests there might be more of a biological difference happening. Okay, we'll talk more about this in a minute, but as I mentioned earlier, diet is thought to be a major contributing factor of hypertension differences by race. So there are dietary differences across the races, which we might talk about in a future video. But sodium, salt intake, is thought to be the main factor influencing blood pressure, at least the main dietary factor. And we're going to talk about that more in a minute. But it's thought that there's a genetic differences between Africans and non-Africans related to salt retention that might be the main culprit behind blood pressure differences. Okay, and the only last thing to say about this paper, or at least one of the last things to say about it, is that white people and Black people respond to hypertension medications differently. So we don't need to get bogged down by the details here, but this line here, it's referring to different treatments for hypertension. So inhibitors for different genes and signaling pathways. And basically, some of these are more or less effective in white people versus Black people. And this again suggests that because these inhibitors and activators aren't having the same effect across the races, that suggests that there's some different biology happening across the different races that might be responsible for hypertension differences. Okay, another factor that might be contributing to higher hypertension rates in Africans is African Americans have higher rates of obesity, and obesity is known to promote high blood pressure. Okay, so hypertension both causes and is caused by obesity. They're in a feedback loop. So it could be the case that African Americans have higher rates of obesity, and therefore that causes higher rates of hypertension. Although it's not clear what the direction of causation is there regarding African Americans. Okay, but that's the main takeaway from this paper. We'll briefly look at this graph here at the bottom. This is data that they took from another source, since again, this is a review article. They didn't do any original research. But it shows hypertension rates on the y-axis broken down by population group. So there's white males, Black males, white females, and Black females. And then it's also across different time spans. So the takeaway is, once again, there's a difference by race, obviously. And then across time, that difference doesn't really go away. So again, if the discrepancy in hypertension rates was caused by things like discrimination or social factors, well, those social factors should be lessened across time, as we've done a lot to try to correct for, supposed discrimination or injustices. So if that was causing this, you'd expect the discrepancy between the groups to go away, not to be persistent or even increasing. Okay, so that's an important point. But now we're going to go and we're going to look at some other papers talking about why there might be a difference in hypertension across the races. Okay, so we're going to look at this paper. This looks at a gene that plays an important role in controlling blood pressure. Okay, so there's this gene called CYP3A5 that is thought to contribute to blood pressure. And not to jump the gun, but we're going to see there are racial differences in which gene version people have for this gene. And that's thought to be a major factor that influences blood pressure across race. Okay, so with this paper, again, it's somewhat older. They're just starting to investigate the function of this gene here. They talk about how it's been implicated in blood pressure control and how, if you look at rats that have hypertension, they have higher activity level of this gene. And then if you block that gene, it lowers blood pressure in rats. So it seems certainly to be involved in blood pressure. Okay, now importantly, the mechanism, they speculate a little bit about how that works. We don't really need to be concerned about the details of that here. But the important thing from this paper is that in different human populations, they have different versions of this gene that have been produced by different mutations. So in other words, Europeans, they have a mutated version of this gene that is thought to lower their blood pressure compared to Africans, okay? So there's two versions of this gene that we are concerned about for our purposes. There's the CYP3A5*1 version, which they're calling the expressor version allele. The reason they're calling it that is because this one is more active, so it's more expressed. Okay, but then there's a mutated version that I just mentioned called the *3 version, or a reduced expressor version. So in other words, there's one version in African that's prominent in Africans that is highly active, and then there's a version prominent in Europeans and non-Africans that is not very active. And as we're about to see, those two different versions, they impact blood pressure differently. Okay, so we're going to ignore figure 1 and we're going to jump straight to figure 2. This is showing basically 3 possible gene situations that people can have for this gene. So let me rephrase. For each gene that we have 2 versions, one that we got from our mom and one that we got from our dad. And so with respect to this CYP3A5 gene, there's that mutated version that's less active, which is this *3 version. And then there's the version that's more active, the *1 version. Okay, so for each individual, they could either have 2 copies of the *1 version, they could have 2 copies of the *3 version, or they could have gotten 1 copy of the *1 version and 1 copy of the *3 version. And so they looked at different individuals that had these 3 different genotypes, combination of genes, and what they found is the blood pressure was highest for those that had 2 copies of the active version of this gene. Blood pressure was lowest for people who had 2 copies of the low activity version of this gene. And blood pressure was intermediate for those that had 1 copy of the highly active and 1 copy of the lowly active version of this gene. So the main thing you need to understand from this paper is just that there's this gene called CYP3A5, and depending on if you have the highly active version or the mutated less active version, that impacts your blood pressure. Okay, so this is showing that statistically here. This is a measurement of systolic blood pressure, which is the main one we're interested in people that had, again, 2 copies of the highly active CYP3A5 gene. If they're heterozygous, they've got 1 highly active copy, 1 non-active copy, versus if they have 2 non-active copies. Okay, having the non-active copies lowers blood pressure. Okay. So again, what does this have to do with race? Well, basically this gene, which version of the gene you have, that's related to your race or ethnicity. Okay, so we're going to look at this other paper briefly, and then we'll conclude. But there's one other paper that looked at these CYP3A5 variants and how that might have influenced salt sensitivity and hypertension across races and across geographical areas. Okay, so what they did in this paper, we're only going to look at one of their results. We're not going to go through the entire paper. But first, one thing they highlight in their background section is that like mutated version of the CYP3A5 gene that causes lower blood pressure. Okay, that version is not very prevalent among African Americans. Okay, 27 to 50%. Okay, it's highly prevalent among whites, so somewhere between 85 and 95%, meaning the version that causes lower blood pressure is very high among whites, and it's sort of in between for Asians. Okay, so what this suggests is that, again, based on the race, they have different levels of activity of this gene, which then influences their blood pressure. So with this paper, the only figure that we're really going to focus on is this last one. And basically, this is showing each dot, focus on the blue dots. Each dot represents a different population. And on the y-axis, it's the prevalence of that blood pressure lowering version of the gene. And then on the x-axis, it's distance from the equator. Okay, so populations that are closer to the equator, they have less of this blood pressure lowering version of the gene. A lot of the blue dots are down here. Okay, as you move away from the equator, okay, most of those populations of people, they have a very high prevalence of this blood pressure lowering version of the gene. Okay. So again, this suggests that different human populations have different levels of this gene version. And there's another gene they looked at here with a similar effect. And so why is there a difference in this gene version across populations? Well, it's thought that in hot environments, so like near the equator in African conditions, there's selection for people who retain water better. In other words, because the environment in Africa and near the equator is very hot, it might not always be easy to access water and to find water. Additionally, people are probably sweating more, which means they're losing salt. And so there should be selection for people who retain salt and retain water better. Okay? And so that's why it's thought that Africans have been selected for better salt retention and better water retention. Now, that might have been adaptive in that situation, but in an environment where salt is plentiful, and so is water, excess salt retention and excess water retention, that basically just increases blood volume to the point where it increases blood pressure. All right, so now non-African populations where they were able to get access to water more easily, there would have been selection against water retention because you don't want high blood pressure. Okay, so that's thought to be one of the main environmental differences that led to different selective pressures that led to genetic differences that lead to differences in hypertension rates. Okay, so they speculate about that a little bit in this paper. Okay, so if you're curious about that, right here they say it's proposed that the version of this CYP3A5 gene that promotes high blood pressure, okay, that promotes water retention, and that might have been adaptive in populations that would frequently experience water shortages, but it's maladaptive now. So to summarize all of these papers and the purpose of this video, there are differences in hypertension rates by race, and it's thought that this has to do in part by genetic factors, such as this CYP3A5 gene that helps retain water and retain salt, and that might be due to historical environmental pressures that faced the different continents. So again, the reason this paper matters is that if there are differences in hypertension rates across race, and that's due to genetic, at least in part to genetic factors, and maybe not as much due to social conditions of today, then the narrative that health disparities across race in America are due to like white racism or discrimination or differences in privilege or things like that, those narratives become weaker. So we'll cover other genetic differences by human populations in future videos, but thank you for watching.